Do you it's a loaded question because I know you're gonna say yes, but I guess it's more of an explain. When the cartels began that shift in whenever it was, 12, 13, 14, 15, somewhere around there, from their main business, which would have been heroin, cocaine, marijuana, to fentanyl. What were you hearing as an investigative journalist living in Mexico at that time?
Yeah, sure thing. So, and one thing's what I was covering then, but also like a lot of this history, you learn about this going forward. So I'll tell a bit more about what I understand now about being the timeline. So you you had this Mexican heroin boom in the 2010s. It was already growing in the 2000s, but it reached its peak in the 2010s. And so you have this issue, one of the big driving forces, of course, from the US demand side was people becoming addicted to prescription opioids and then becoming addicts, losing their prescription, and then buying street heroin, which is it's more complicated, but to be simplistic,
So
that's
just to be clear, we have in the late 90s, Purdue Pharma and others just
yeah,
making OxyContin specifically widely accessible, and by 2010 or so,
yeah,
the supply starts getting reduced greatly because of federal intervention.
mm,
Yet we have a lot of people still addicted, and so that's what you're referring to.
exactly. So this is, I think, one of the big drivers of the heroin boom in Mexico. So this heroin boom, so the cartels have actually been moving uh, opium, was their first kind of beginning drug of the Mexican drug traffickers going back a century, and moving opium for heroin, going back to the 1920s, at least again a century, and so it's been around the whole time, but there's a big growth, and particularly then you had drug traffickers, including the Sinaloan drug traffickers, but various drug trafficking organizations, and buying a lot of the source material for the heroin, the opium, from the state of Guerrero. So Guerrero, you had this massive poppy boom. Again, they've been actually, and I was up earlier this year up in mountains in Guerrero, talking to opium farmers about this, and there's been opium there since going back to the 1950s, and there was a boom in the 1970s, which they associate with the Vietnam War. They associate there. They kind of hear the Vietnam, War. They kind of know that it was kind of, for them, that meant more money for them. But it was a big boom, and it reached peak prices for them in about the mid 2000s. About 2016 was the peak of the heroin.
And again, that's driven largely by obviously the demand in the US, largely attributed to the shutting off of the prescription opioid spigot. Suddenly, we have a lot of customers, and they step in.
Yeah, exactly. And like these things, you have demand, you have supply, and both of the, I think both of these are factors which play off each other. You start creating a lot of heroin, it gets out in the street, it becomes available, you get more, so these things can play off each other. But to give a sense of what that meant, so the prices, this one particular village I went to, and they actually had prices capped by a local cartel or local crime organization, a kind of fairly local crime group, who would fix the price of the of how much they sold kilos of opium paste. So you see there the opium fields, and then they have these kind of blade where they cut in this special thing they make, which is kind of knife with two blades, which they used to scrape, and they scrape it into these tins, into these cans, these tins. The cans, they're scraping the opium gum. It smells kind of fruity, and it becomes opium gum. And that reached the price in pesos around that time of around, they capped it at something like 33,000 pesos. But they were saying that some people that had other villages get up to 40,000 pesos for one of these kilos of gum, which is a couple of $1,000 for a kilo of the gum. That peaked. Nowadays, I mean, we'll get into why, but nowadays it's gone down to like 3,000 pesos kilos. Basically, what is one of the symptoms of fentanyl as it then wiped out this business of farmers growing opium. Now, they typically, of a lot of these drug growing communities, I mean, these are peasant farmers at one end of the narco chain, but there was no investment with this money generally. They didn't really invest it much in communities. You know, it's still dirt roads. They're still poor. And a lot of them would they'd harvest their opium, then they go down to town to sell it, and and then they very quickly buy a quad bike or something, go out and get drunk, but it wasn't really invested in the community. So this was the heroin timeline. Now, at the same time, fentanyl starts to come into this equation around 2013 kind of time. Now, there's different, probably look at different dates, but there's this drug trafficker, Damaso Lopez, El Mini Leak, who discussed this in an interview with my colleague Luis Chaparro. And he said that 2013 was when they began putting fentanyl into heroin. And they called it Chiba Sintética. Chiba was the name they used for heroin, goat Chiba, and then Chiba Sintética, synthetic Chiba. So they began as a way to they said that he's described in the quote, was paraphrasing it, was something like, we actually sent people over to China who learned how to do this, who learned about this with pharmacists in China, the Sinaloa cartel.